Hello, I'm Dick Courcelle, and I welcome you to Vermont Bound, Conversations with Storytellers, a production of Rutland Free Library. Vermont Bound is replacing the biannual tables of content where patrons had the opportunity to meet and dine with authors at the Rutland Free Library, but with COVID-19, we've had to adjust things a bit. So Rutland Free Library is bringing the authors to you. My guest today is Peter Hogenkamp. Peter is the author of the April-released The Intern, which was published earlier this year by Touchpoint Press. Peter's new book, The Vatican Conspiracy, is being released in October from an imprint of Hachette, UK, and there is a spring release planned, and it's tentatively titled Doubt. So I welcome Peter Hogenkamp to this first of our Vermont Bound Conversations with Storytellers. Welcome, Peter.
Dick, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this. And I wanted to thank the Rutland Free Library for having me as well. Obviously every author looks forward to being able to talk about his or her books, and so thanks for having me.
Great. This is I'm looking forward to this conversation. So for viewers that are not necessarily familiar with you, tell us a little bit about Peter Hogenkamp.
So I come from upstate New York, and I grew up on a little house in the country next to my uncle's farm. So I always tell people that I was raised on a farm, which is more or less true kind of thing. And we worked on the farm growing up, which was one of my almost all of my favorite memories from my youth come from working on the Spring Grove Dairy Farm. A little plug to my cousin who actually helped me with the book. And so I went to Holy Cross College, where my father went. And after Holy Cross College, I went off to Europe for 3 years to teach chemistry in Salzburg, Austria. And when I got home from Salzburg, Austria, I went to medical school and then residency. And I've been practicing in Vermont for the last 24 years.
Great.
I can remember moving here in a rented U-Haul van with my son on the on the passenger seat like it was yesterday, and it was 24 years ago.
Yes, time does fly.
It's amazing.
So for those that you just talked a little bit about your early life. So you're a busy practicing physician, and you are also.
My wife would disagree with that.
Well, let's say you're a practicing physician.
There we go.
And you are a published author of fiction. Now there have been some notable physicians that have been very successful authors. Anton Chekhov, as an example. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Robin Cook, to name but a few. So each of those careers, in particular if you're going to remain active as an author, each of those careers is very, very demanding. How do you manage both careers at the level that you're managing them?
Well, when I first started writing, which was about 15 years ago, I turned 40. And I used to write when I was a kid, and I kind of got away from it when I got into high school and then college, but I used to love to write. And when I turned 40, the itch kind of came back, and I remember it vividly. I was watching college football on a Saturday night, and I went downstairs, found one of my old college notebooks and a pencil, and I started scribbling the beginning of a novel into that on a Saturday night, and I stuffed it underneath the couch when I was done. And I would write on Saturday nights after everybody else had gone to bed for a while. And then when it kind of got to be a thing, I started waking up early in the morning for a while to do that. Because at that time, I had 4 small kids. I was working, a lot, much more than I am now. In the interest of full disclosure, I used to work about 80 hours a week, and now I'm probably much closer to 40. So I have a lot more time to write now than I did then. So early, it was a struggle early, and I didn't really get that much done. As my kids got older, and one big thing that happened to me is, as a practicing physician, I used to take care of my patients everywhere they went, in the office, the hospital, the nursing home, and it was busy. I had to round on my patients every day of the week if I wasn't, out of town. So the Rutland Hospital did me a huge favor, and they instituted this great hospitalist program. So they would then take care of the patients in the hospital, and that saved me immense amounts of time. So once that happened, I also gave up my nursing home practice once the nursing homes established their own in-house physicians. So now I simply practice as an outpatient physician, and there's a lot more time. So that's been great.
Okay. You talked just a little bit about kind of the genesis and the origins of your writing, but there's that old saying, there's a book in everyone, and the late Christopher Hitchens once quipped that, and for most people it should stay inside them. With you, however, that certainly is not the case. But when did you realize that there really was a book inside of you?
Well, when I was in the 4th grade, Mrs. Dawes, who was my 4th grade teacher, I wrote a story about a police officer and his dog from the from the viewpoint of the dog. And Mrs. Dawes thought it was really good. So I actually sent that story to the New Yorker when I was in the 4th grade. And I got my first rejection when I was 10. I like to tell people I've been rejected for many, many years. But they actually gave me a free year subscription to the New Yorker. So that was probably my first compensation as a writer. You know, I've always loved the idea of narratives. I love movies. I love sports. But I was thinking about this the other day. I love sports from the standpoint of the narrative. For instance, my favorite thing to watch is the Masters. And they do such a wonderful job in the Masters at spinning a narrative. I don't really care so much about the golf itself, but about the story behind the winner. I love movies. I love the narrative in movies. I love the narrative in fiction books. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but what I do read tends to be narrative nonfiction. So I just love the whole idea of the narrative. I'm always trying to spin them in my head. And, you know, sooner or later, you know, you've got all these ideas spinning in your head. Sooner or later, you've got to kind of, you know, consolidate them on paper. Or else, you know, I've heard other writers say, you know, it's the only way they are able to keep sane kind of thing, keep all these stories spinning, keep them from spinning out of control in your head, is actually put them down on paper. And so as I was telling you before, I started this novel when I was 40, and I have this rule that I think every writer should follow, and that is they should write their first novel and then put it in their desk drawer and never show anybody. Because there is so much to learn about writing a book. You know, obviously the book will begin and end with its narrative. It's a story. And if you're telling a good story, you have a good book. But beyond that, there's a lot of other, you know, kind of details. And you know, there's grammar, there's punctuation, there's pacing, there's transitions, there's all these kind of writing technicalities that are important. Because if you screw them up, you ruin the story. And so with my first book, which was called The Lazarus Manuscript, you know, I think the story was okay. I didn't tell it very well. I did try to publish it, and unsuccessfully. But I tell everybody that first novel, you've got to write and you put it away, I think. I mean, there are people who've actually published their very first novel, and I think those people just, you know, goes to show you how talented they are. In my case, I learned a tremendous amount, and when I sat down to write my second novel, which was in 2009, which started out being called The Jesuit, and then I renamed it Absolution. And then when I was able to sign with the publisher renamed it the Vatican Conspiracy. So the books actually had 3 names. But when I sat down in 2009 to write this story about a priest in Italy, you know, I had this first book behind me. And I really had, because I had learned so many things through my own mistakes, I really knew what I was doing to some extent. And so, you know, I like to talk about, you have to have a good story, but you also have to tell it well. My sister is always telling her husband, Bill, tell Peter the story about this. Or she said, tell Peter the story about this. And I'm like, Mary Jo, why don't you tell me the story yourself? And she's like, well, I'll screw it up. And she's right. Because these stories may have happened to her or them, but Bill tells them beautifully. And it's the telling of the story sometimes that can accentuate it or actually even kind of ruin it. So I came up with this idea to write this story about a priest who got involved with trying to stop a plot against the Pope. And the stories just kind of evolved with time. And it was really all the techniques that I learned from my first kind of failed novel that I was able to make the story kind of pop out. And so you said, getting back to your original question, there's a story in all of us. I think that there is. And I think a lot of people with time and training can write that story. I do. One of the things that I always like to talk about is, if you really want to write well, write. It's like people that want to play golf well. Go play golf. Writing, like anything else, you get better with time. Currently, as you mentioned, I appreciate you talked about the next book, which I have called Doubt. It's the second book in the Marco Vanetti series. It's coming out on April 12th of 2021. And I had to write that book in 6 months while also editing my first book, while also trying to do some promotion for the intern, while also practicing medicine, while also trying to be a good husband and father kind of thing, which I would like to say are my priorities. And so there was a lot to do. And there was no time for me to sit down at the desk and just kind of flounder with words, which is what happened to me for many, many years. Some days I sit down to write and come up with nothing. Now I have this schedule. I have to write 1,500 words every day that I write, which is 4 days a week. And I have a schedule. This book is due to the publisher on November 2nd, and it has to be in. And I've been very pleased that I sit down. I haven't had too much writer's block. I've been able to be real happy with the stuff that I've written, but it's because I've been practicing. I've been doing it again and again. So I think there is a book in everybody, or at least a story, and I think we can all tell it with time. It just becomes a question of how much inclination you have to do that. I love to write. I really do. One of my friends from college, who's a brilliant guy, a successful businessman, I remember he and I would sit down in college, and I would help him write his papers, and he hated to write. And he calls me all the time. He says, "I don't understand how you can do this. I hate writing." I love to write. When I sit down at the keyboard, 3 hours goes by in the drop of a hat. It's something I love to do. I love to form sentences. I try to create themes in my writing, so that maybe I'll wake up in this particular chapter I want to write down, maybe use sea themes. So I'll use words like waves, or just kind of bring recurrent imagery of the sea into my writing. And you probably won't see it that much because my editor usually gets rid of all of it. But it's the type of thing I aspire to do. Sometimes I'm a big fan of Cormac McCarthy, who is, if you haven't read Cormac McCarthy, he's probably the best wordsmith on the face of the earth. He uses language in a way that I've never seen anyone else use it. Now, he's not for everybody, because he does use his vocabulary is immense, and sometimes it gets in the way of the story. Mm-hmm. But I try to do different things with my writing. I try to use, for instance, I try to use words, or especially verbs, in ways that they're not normally used but still make sense. But I enjoy the process. So I think everyone out there who wants to write a book, find a way to make it fun for you.
Well, my next question, in preparing for this interview, because this was kind of the first author interview I've ever done. So in preparing for it, I learned that the question that most authors abhor, absolutely hate being asked, is, where do you get your ideas? In fact, David Mamet, when asked that during an interview, simply said, "I think of them," which pretty much that ends the conversation, right, if there was to be any. But why do you think that question sparks such a negative response in writers?
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because I love to talk about where I got my ideas. When I was finished college, I wanted to go to medical school. And my pre-medical advisor said that he wanted me to take a couple years off before he sent me. And because my application depended on a letter from him, he was basically telling me I couldn't go to medical school yet. It's a story I've told many, many times, because it has a happy ending. And we all love happy endings. So off I trotted to Europe. And I had a job teaching chemistry in Salzburg, Austria, which were 3 great years of my life. I remember them very fondly. I still have many friends from that experience. In the process of traipsing about Europe, I came up with a number of unbelievable settings. And at the time, I thought to myself, this setting right here would make a great setting for a novel. And, I kind of made a copious mental notes about these places, and even some, actual written notes as well. And then years later, when I came up with an idea for a novel, I said, I'm going to go back to those settings and put this story that I've come up with into these settings. But where I got my idea was actually, as I mentioned before, from my failed first book. I had this book that I wrote, and I sent it to a number of agents and publishers. And a lot of them were nice enough to kind of send me some feedback, kind of thing. Many of them, said, not for us, or they didn't respond at all. But I did get some response, and the response that I got was always the same thing. They're like, Peter, for you to write a thriller, and again, the thriller genre in books is extremely crowded. It's a very popular genre. People love thrillers. There's literally hundreds or possibly thousands of them written every year. But you've got to come up with something new. You can't just come out as the jaded FBI detective, with a drinking problem, trying to save his ex-wife, and that kind of thing. The typical plot that we see in these things. You've got to come up with something new. So I went back to my days at Holy Cross College, where I studied, studied chemistry at the point in time. But the Jesuits were in charge of us at Holy Cross College, and they weren't just my teachers. I had Jesuits as teachers. One of them lived in my dorm. Obviously, they were chaplains, but they were also mentors and just people you saw around, and you got to know them. And I was so impressed with these Jesuit priests from the standpoint of their intelligence, their thoughtfulness, their humanity. And they're all peace-loving people as well, as priests. And I thought to myself, how about a thriller where we take a Jesuit priest with all the qualities that I've just talked about and put him into some, a situation where he's, stressed with violence, with perhaps a romantic element, with bloodshed, because the conflict between his training and the person that he is and the world he's now thrust himself into, that creates tremendous conflict. So that's where that idea kind of evolved over many, many years. And I'll remember that when I sat down one night and wrote the first chapter of The Jesuit, I found myself not breathing in some periods of time. Like the air was sticking in my throat, my heart was racing, and I'm thinking to myself, I got a real book here. This is a good book. And, I never felt any of that when I was writing my first book. But the tension was coming out of the page. I could feel it in my fingers as I was writing the book. And so that's how I knew I had a real, legit book. Now, having said that, that was in 2009 when I started, and this book is going to be published in October of 2020. It was 11 years in the process of getting it done. And so for those of you who are watching, who are trying to go out, down this route of writing or creating narratives or being a storyteller or a musician or kind of following their passion in any way, I'd say there's only really one quality that you need besides, the ability to do what you're trying to do, and that is persistence, which I credit my mom with. My mom, great attitude. You couldn't keep her down. If she failed, she'd be back up on her feet. You just got to keep going and believe in yourself.
Do you read your work after publication? The reason, that may sound like a strange question, but the reason I ask that, because there are many well-known screen and television actors who absolutely refuse to watch, never have watched any of their shows or movies because they pick out things that I wished I had said this differently, or perhaps the inflection should have been. Do you go back and read after the book is published?
Nope. So my first book, which was called The Intern, which was published in April, I have not looked at it since it was published. I actually read from it on a couple of interviews. I did some readings from it, but other than that, no. And I like the point that you made, Dick. When I read it, I'm like, oh, I wish I'd used a different word here, or this isn't good, or so. The other thing is that by the time that you're finally ready, with Hachette, who's a company publishing the Vatican Conspiracy, I did 6 edits after they accepted the book for publication. I did a developmental edit, I did a structural edit, I did a copy edit, a line edit, all with different people, by the way. And then I did 2 proofreads. I went over that book 6 times after it was okayed for publication. So there is a little bit of fatigue factor in it as well. And so the one caveat, so I doubt I will read the Vatican Conspiracy once it's published in a couple of weeks. But I will listen to it, and I'm very excited to say that it was selected to be produced for an audiobook. So I really am excited about that. They got a very talented American voice actor to narrate it. So I'm looking forward to listening to it. I won't read it, other than the fact that as I'm writing Doubt, which is the kind of preliminary title for the second book in the Marco Vanetti thriller series, I constantly have to go back to the first book, like little details kind of thing. What did I say in this scene? Because it's important. So I have to go back to the second book, but I won't read it cover to cover again. I definitely won't.
Let's talk just a little bit about the intern. Having read that book, and I enjoyed that. And without giving away the plot, the intern is about an intern, Dr. Maggie Johnson, who is working at Charity Hospital in Spanish Harlem, mm-hmm. and develops a bond with a terminally ill boy. How much of Maggie Johnson is Peter Hogenkamp?
Quite a bit. I'd like to be more like Maggie Johnson because I think she's a tremendously admirable character. But when you write, you are writing, so much of it is autobiographical. It just has to be. Because we say it all the time, you write what you know and you know yourself. So there's a lot about Maggie Johnson that's me. Maggie, the situation that she's in is her father is a renowned orthopedic surgeon, and he's wanted her to be a doctor ever since he gave her the plastic doctor kit when she was 3 years of age. And in the book, I call him the architect of her future because he has planned every stage of her life. And Maggie's a pleaser. She wants to please her dad. But what she's gotten for this is that she's unhappy because she doesn't really want to be a radiologist. Her father has wanted a radiologist for his orthopedic practice, and so he's kind of groomed her to be a radiologist. What she really wants to be is a pediatrician. And she's rotating through a pediatrics rotation. When you go into radiology, you do a year of what we call transitional medicine, and you basically become a general intern, and you rotate through all the normal rotations that an intern would go through: general surgery, OBGYN, pediatrics, internal medicine, that kind of thing. So when she's rotating through this pediatrics rotation, and keep in mind now that she's always wanted to be a pediatrician, she meets this boy, Bobby, who's a 12-year-old boy who's a ward of the state. He's been terminally ill since 7, and he's basically been sent to this hospital because nobody else wants him. He can't go anywhere else. His foster home won't have him back. And so as a consequence of him living in the hospital where his friends were the custodians and all the other adults in the hospital, he's very adult-like. But he's still, at his core, a 12-year-old boy. So you get this kind of neat character who's kind of adult-like in one way, but still a 12-year-old boy in another. Maggie forms this huge bond with Bobby because Bobby often says, when you're about to die, there's no time to kind of pussyfoot around things. He's very blunt, and he meets Maggie and kind of falls for Maggie as almost like a mother type of figure for him or a friend type figure. But he is as good for Maggie as Maggie is good for him. He has never been loved in his entire life. His mother died when she was giving birth to him. He's been put into one foster home after the next, and he's been cared for but not loved. And so it's kind of made him bitter and caustic. As a consequence of that, he's when he deals with people, he tends to be like that. But Maggie is able to kind of get through his caustic, sarcastic nature and see the little boy that just wants to be loved. And they form this wonderful relationship. I did have a similar experience to Maggie when I was a pediatric intern. I met this kid who was 12, who was the actual kind of impetus for the story. And I met him for just a day and a half because he basically admitted him so that he could die in the hospital. And I'll never forget the kid. He was a wonderful, wonderful boy, very different from the Bobby that's in the book. But the thing that stuck with me was, I met this kid in 1994. I still remember him clearly. It's amazing how much of a bond you can form with somebody in a day and a half. And I believe that to be true. Someone was saying one time, well, how well do you know this person? You've only known him for a couple of months. And I think back to my experience with this young man that was dying. He was so nice, so polite. When I walked into the room, he was literally bleeding out of his eyeballs because his body wasn't making the platelets that stop bleeding. And when I handed him a tissue, he's like, thank you very much. The kid was wonderful. And he was optimistic. How can you be optimistic when you're going to die in the next day? And he knew he was going to die. I asked him if he was having pain. No, he was lying because he didn't want his parents to suffer more. I mean, they were already suffering from the fact that he was going to die. He didn't want them to know that he was going to die in pain. He was just that kind of kid, Would have been such a wonderful human being, life cut short at 12 years of age. But one of the other things I was trying to say with this book is, this kid may have died at 12, but his legacy lives on. I'm sure his parents remember what a wonderful person he is. I met him for a day and a half. I remember him. So I think we can do more in short periods of time than we realize. And I think that basically the love that Maggie has with Bobby and the intern, it's a thing that counts. It makes his life worthwhile. And whereas Bobby had thought his life was meaningless prior to that, the relationship that he develops with Maggie gives meaning to his life. And that meaning will always exist. It doesn't go away. It's not temporary or ephemeral. It's a permanent thing.
So, in reading The Intern, I'm, figuring out how's this going to end. And when you begin writing a story, do you know how it's going to end?
Yes, I do. So I've written now 5 books, and every one of them I had the whole thing kind of mapped out in my head ahead of time. And if you don't, it's going to call for so much editing. I get a headache thinking about the amount of editing that you'd have to do if you don't know the whole story. Because even knowing the whole story, there's a tremendous amount of editing that's involved. I wish I knew the person who said this, but some very prominent writer said, you don't write great books. You revise and edit great books. In other words, the making of a great book is all in the revision, it's all in the editing. Because as I said before, Dick, you have to have a great story to have a great book. It's the essence of a book is the story. But if you don't tell it well, you've ruined it. And if you don't know the whole story, I think that's going to come across in the way it's read out on paper. I think it's going to come across as disjointed, and so perhaps I just don't have the level of talent that allows me to sit down and write that without knowing the whole thing. So I really do try to have a general outline. In fact, my publisher requires one. So when they signed me, they said, for your second book here, we would like an outline for this. And we actually worked on the outline as well before I even started the book. It's very helpful.
And just quickly, the last before we end our show, who do you like to read?
Well, that's a great question. My favorite author by far is Daniel Silva.
As is mine.
Yes, and Daniel Silva. If you haven't read Daniel Silva, and I know you have, you should read the Gabriel Allon series. It's absolutely wonderful. There's now like 19 or 20 of them.
Yeah, The Order was published back in July.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Order is about a very similar subject to my book, so I'm very interested I've been writing Daniel Silva for a number of years, and he does write me back kind of very quickly, but I've always got his website and say, I just love this book kind of thing, and usually it's interesting, I get comments back from his wife, Jamie Gangle, who's an NBC correspondent. I think she does most of his kind of correspondence. Right. But I'd like to get him to do, obviously, a blurb on my book kind of thing. We'll see if that works. But they're very similar books. If you haven't read Daniel Silva, he's wonderful. But there's a bunch of other authors I like. I'm a huge Alistair MacLean fan. He was actually my very first love as a reader. And Alistair MacLean was a Scottish author. He wrote a number of famous books called Where Eagles Dare, Force 10 from Navarone, The Guns of Navarone. And he's been passed away for a number of years, but he wrote about 30 books, which were excellent. I love Frederick Forsyth, Robert Ludlum, all the classic thriller writers I do love quite a bit. There's a guy by the name of Robert Wilson, who's an English writer who lives in Portugal, and he writes A Small Death in Lisbon is one of my favorite books of all time. It's wonderful. So I tend to read the same. I tend to read thrillers pretty much only. I don't read too much literary fiction kind of thing. My wife's a big reader of literary fiction. She's always trying to get me to read her books. But as she tells people, if there's no bombs, explosions, or bullets in a book, Peter's not going to read it.
Oh, that's great. Well, Peter Hogenkamp, I can't thank you enough for kind of kicking off Vermont Bound Conversations with Storytellers of Rutland Free Library. I wish we had more time to talk about your craft, and very exciting, of course, the Vatican Conspiracy to be released in October this month.
October 20th, yeah.
And next spring, Doubt, or whatever it actually happens to be called. By
I really hope they
publisher.
keep that Doubt.
That's a great title.
Yeah.
So there will be more Rutland Free Library Vermont Bound interviews coming up this fall. Again, because of COVID-19, tables of content cannot happen in its usual format. And the author interviews will include Christian Heidegger, Julie Berry, and local personalities A.J. Marrow and Big Lenny. So please visit Rutland Free Library's website. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. And thank you for watching and supporting your local library. Thank you.